What's up, music fans of the internet? I'm Derek.
And I'm Kevin.
And together we're last week's album. We're bringing you the only reviews with two different views. And this week we're talking about Eternally Even by Jim James. And we're asking the big question, how odd is Jim James on Eternally Even? Cheers, Kevin, and everyone at home.
Cheers, Derek, and everyone at home.
So Jim James is the frontman of the indie rock icons My Morning Jacket. This album is his second solo album following 2012's Regions of Light and Sound of God. Eternally Even was produced by Blake Mills, who recently worked on Alabama Shake's Sound and Color. Unlike Jim James' last solo album, this one was not recorded entirely by Jim James. He enlisted the help of other musicians here. Without further ado, let's talk about what Eternally Even sounds like. Kevin, what'd you think?
I thought this album sounds like classic soul and funk if it were chopped and screwed on an underwater set of turntables.
Yes. I think Eternally Even sounds like My Morning Jacket tires of Jim James' political rants, so he decides to rock the vote with another solo album.
Yeah, he definitely touches on some politics in this one.
So let's talk about some highlights. Kevin, what'd you think?
Sure. My first highlight is the way that he puts a modern psychedelic spin on these sort of classic soul and funk sounds. I thought that was just a really fresh take and one I haven't heard very often. It's also very fun. It keeps you kind of on your toes and guessing what's he going to do next by taking these sort of retro sounds but pushing them in a new direction.
I couldn't agree more. My first highlight is literally horns, horns, horns. They're not prominent, but they help create a spacey soul vibe throughout the tracks where they appear on True Nature, In the Moment, and Eternally Even.
My next highlight is his lyrics here. I thought he gets more personal and direct than he has with My Morning Jacket, which feels right, given that this is a solo album, but the lyrics are still great for the most part. He covers politics, spirituality, love. My favorite line has to be on We Ain't Getting Any Younger Part 2, where he says, "Peace written to pieces." I just thought it was a great economical line, and the song is sort of a call to action to do something instead of just saying something, but at the same time, it's a condemnation of our tendency to repeat history instead of learning from it. So just peace written to pieces summed all that up really, really well. And I thought the album as a whole.
The lyrics were definitely a standout to me as well. Other themes I kind of picked up on a little bit was also youth, as you kind of alluded to earlier, and We Ain't Getting a Younger Part 2. But then later he even talks about aging on Eternally Even. Another economical line here. Truth be told, there's gold in growing older. So those were some highlights. Now let's talk about lowlights. Kevin, what'd you think?
First up, the murky, jammy nature of this whole thing, I thought ended up letting a lot of these songs sound the same. And they could have used a little bit more energy and more variety from song to song. Secondly, Jim James has an amazing voice, and he only uses a fraction of his vocal talent here. He basically kind of talks through the whole thing instead of singing and belting like we all know he can. And those are my two complaints, and to be honest, they're pretty big ones for me.
I actually had a few lowlights myself. The first one, I almost felt like this was like 3 EPs smashed together into a full length. Like you got your first 3 tracks, which were spacey, psychedelic, jam outs. And then the second part, you have We Ain't Getting Any Younger, parts 1 and 2. And then you got the last 3 tracks, which I alluded to earlier, horns, horns, horns. Another thing, I guess this is a small gripe, but just much looser song structures throughout. But at the same time, I think this also kind of aided the more stream of conscious lyrics. I think the two kind of go hand in hand. Because a lot of the lyrics were more personal and direct, I think that was aided a lot by the stream of conscious type format the lyrics took on. And so that being said, I'm going to let some of the looser song structure pass a little bit. Those were some lowlights. Now let's talk about the overall rating and answering the big question, how odd is Jim James on Eternally Even? Kevin, why don't you start us off?
Sure. I will start with the question, how odd is Jim James on Eternally Even? I would say for me, a little, but not near enough. He has a lo-fi and low-key earthy vibe to this record, and it's really smooth and inviting, but also just not interesting enough to keep my attention for the whole album. I commend him for releasing a socially and politically conscious album. Given this insane election season, I'm actually surprised we haven't heard more of these from artists, so I appreciate that. And I definitely think it's a stronger effort than his first solo album, but this one just really didn't do that much for me. I love Jim James. I just think he's a much better collaborator or leader than a solo artist, and I think this album suffered because of it. So overall, I'm going to give this one a 2 out of 5.
I think you made some solid points there. I think maybe we're going to disagree, maybe in some small points. But to answer the big question, how odd is Jim James on Eternally Even? I think he's so odd, he's a prime number. Like, you could take the Fibonacci sequence out about 12 or 13 digits, and that's how odd he is. I do applaud the effort of taking on some of the social issues here lyrically, and I think he did so in such a way where some of these tracks you can look back on every 4 years or anytime a democracy is charged with an election. He really does call on everyone to exercise their right to vote, and I think that is a positive message. And so even though maybe it was inspired by this crazy election, at the same time, it doesn't speak solely to this crazy election, I think. And so I think he did well there, but this one isn't likely to be in high rotation in my playlist. So I'm going to give this one a 3 out of 5. And with Kevin's, that's a combined 5 out of 10. So tell us what you think about Eternally Even by Jim James. Thanks again for joining us here at last week's album. Don't forget to subscribe here on the YouTube or on the podcast. And as always, I'm Derek.
And I'm Kevin.
Cheers, everyone.